Hello, my name is Emma Fassio and welcome to my YouTube channel where I love to share my passion for knitting and creativity. Today I want to talk to you about gauge and samples and personal tension gauge because it's something very personal and it can influence your project, and especially if you're following pattern instructions. So it's very important to understand your tension, your gauge, and the one written in the pattern. First of all, it's something very personal because there is no person that has the same exact gauge of another person. And for example, if I knit with my left and right hand, I will have two different gauges. And that happens especially when I work with two different colors and I'm making fair isle and I have the thread in my left and right hands. And I understand that I have two different gauges. Gauge can also be influenced by our state of mind, by our emotions. If we are very relaxed and like falling asleep, tend to knit very loose. And instead, if we have anxieties, we are tense, we are going to knit much tighter. So it is important to understand also that it's personal because we all move our hands in a different way. Also, the materials of our needles can influence our gauge because if we are using metallic points, it's different from the wooden or the bamboo. For example, if I knit with metallic points, I knit much looser. With wooden ones made, we could say that it's like in between, and with bamboo I tend to be much tighter, so it's perfect for socks, for example. It is important because if we are following some pattern instructions, we need to understand our gauge in respect of the person that has written the pattern. So we have to, verify if our gauge is exactly the same, or if it's looser, for example. If we follow the instructions for our size, we are going to actually make a bigger garment. So we might need to change points, and you need to understand the sizes, and you might go down a needle size, or decide to go down a size. So if you're thinking about knitting the M size, you might then go for the S size in order to understand the perfect wearability and ease that you want to have on your garment. So I suggest for your sample to make it bigger than the 10 for 10 centimeters where we are going to measure our gauge. I suggest generally to make it 15 for 15 centimeters in order to measure the number of stitches and rows in the center of it. But then I'll show you better with some examples. It is important to wash it as we are going to wash the final garment, because we need to understand what happens to our yarn when we wash it, because some yarns might become bigger, for example, just explode, and and then you will have a very big garment. And it's also important to understand that if you have a loose gauge, the garment and the sample might tend to become bigger and when you wash it, and instead if you need to work with a tighter gauge, usually your sample will remain more similar to what you have knitted. So it's very important also to understand this. I will show you with some garments like the Trilly Sweater and the normal shawl what can happen with different gauges. So because it's also a very interesting thing to use in a creative way, and it's important to see also what happens when you use different stitch patterns with your project or your gauge sample. So that's why it's important to work the sample as the same stitch pattern of the indications in the pattern you are going to follow. For example, in my pattern, in Nothing is Written, it's intended in stockinette stitch. And here I am with two samples of the Norma shawl, and I want you to show what happens if you knit them in with different gauge. You can see it if but just looking at them. This is a tighter version knitted with a smaller needle, like 3.5, and this is the looser one. So you can see it's more like very drapey, very wide, and the other one it's smaller and it's less drapey because it has been knitted tighter. This is very important to understand also because you have to understand what you prefer. You might like a looser gauge like this one, so it's and it becomes bigger, or you might prefer a tighter version. And so now I'm going to show you exactly with a close-up the stitches. And here is the close-up. You can see here in the first one how it's knitted tighter, and you can also see the different effect when I move it, that it's less drapey in this one than the one I knitted with bigger needles. You can see how drapier it is. And this is important to understand because it's also a question of personal taste. Of course, if you knit it with a looser gauge, it's going to become bigger and you might use a little bit more of yarn, and but you will have this drapey effect. If you knit it with a tighter gauge like this one, it's going to become smaller and it's going to have this less drapey effect. So it's important to understand which one you prefer. And here I am with the Trilly Sweater. This one is the first one, the one that you can also see in the pictures of the pattern instructions. And it is the one on which I've written the gauge indications because it's the first one, the one that I created with this type of ease and the gauge I've knitted. I have knitted then other two samples because I wanted to play with in a creative way with gauge. So here it is with here it is Trilly in a new version with a looser gauge. I've knitted it with 4 millimeters needles instead of the 3.5 because I wanted it more a little bit more drapey, not so boxy as the winter version that I'm going to show you next, but you can see how different, and it's a little bit bigger, and I've knitted exactly the same size as the original one, the light blue one I showed you before. And this is only, by playing with gauge and needle size. And now I will show you another versions with a different type of yarn because the first two use cotton and mohair and silk. Instead here I have the winter one. Okay, I have also the long sleeves because I wanted all the boxy effect and a winter version of it. So here it is. See how boxy it is and how much looser. I've knitted the same size as the other two, but I've used 4.5 millimeters needles because I wanted it more drapey, a little bit boxy. And I've also used alpaca yarn, my yarn Mise, instead of the cotton. And so this, by blocking, has made it a little bit wider. So it is important to understand what happens also because you can play in a creative way. Here I have some samples. I played with, for all of them, I've casted on 25 stitches and knitted and worked 25 rows. But I wanted to show you what happens with different stitch patterns and why it is important to make the sample, to measure the gauge, as the same stitch pattern as indicated in pattern instructions. So here you can see I have made the stockinette one, the ribbing, and you see how much smaller in width it is because of the ribbing, knit one, purl one, and this is the garter stitch. So, and you can see it is shorter and wider. So this is how the different effects, and that's why it is important to make the gauge sample in the stitch pattern you're going to use in the garment that you are making. And you can also, if you want to switch, like in your pattern instruction, it's stockinette stitch and you want to make garter stitch, you have to consider to work more rows in order to obtain the same height. And here it is, all the three different samples, and it's very interesting what happens with different stitch patterns. Now we are going to look at what it is, the sample, and here is the one I'm going to use to show you how to measure a gauge in a sample. I always suggest to use a rigid ruler to count the stitches, because if you use like a tape measure that can, move and you cannot find exactly the right count of stitches. Now you position it in the center because you have to count the number of stitches in 10 centimeters. Because you can see at the cast on edge, usually it is a little bit tighter. It's normal, it always happens. And well, it's nice when you work it top down, so you know that, the neckline is going to be a little tighter. No, I'm just joking, but okay, you can see it's a little bit tighter, so here you would have a different gauge in respect to what you will obtain while working. And also the edges are a little bit different from the center. So it's important to make it 15 by 15 centimeters, and you would just position your ruler in the center in order to have, well, mine is a little bit bigger than 15 centimeters, but that's just fine. Now you position it, and you have the first stitch, and you count how many stitches you have in 10 centimeters. And, here we are exactly at the end, the stitch. Now it's perfectly, sometimes it can happen that you have a portion of a stitch. It can happen. And, because it can depend from blocking, because we are using soft material. It's not like in sewing when you have a stiff fabric. So it's natural, it can happen. Now, you have to count how many stitches you have in 10 centimeters, and then when you measure gauge, also to understand how your garment is going to grow, you're going also to count how many stitches you have in 10 rows. Now, when you position your ruler and you count your stitches, and for example, in your pattern instructions, you will find 20 stitches in 10 centimeters, and in your sample, you might have 22 stitches. What is going to happen to your garment? When you're going to cast on all the stitches that are indicated, your garment is going to be smaller because you have a tighter gauge. So what can you do? You might think about trying half a number bigger in needle size and make another sample, so you might see if it works better. Or what happens if you have 18 stitches and the pattern indicates 20 stitches? So when you're going to cast on all the stitches, your garment it's going to be bigger than the one that is indicated in the pattern for the size you're following. So you might decide to go down a number or half a number in needle size. Another important thing to understand is that you might think if you have a tighter gauge, to work a bigger size. So instead of working the S, you might work M. The other important thing is to understand is that while you're working top down. In order also to respect all your body proportions, you might try it on and maybe make those little changes that will make the fitting perfect. Because remember always that gauge is also very personal, and you can make the changes you want while working your garment. So remember, if your number is bigger than the one indicated, so we said, for example, the 22 stitches instead of 20, your garment is going to be smaller. And instead, if you have a smaller number, 18 instead of 20, your garment is going to be bigger. I hope that you enjoyed the video and that you have found it helpful, and to see how also it can be creative to use gauge. If you have any questions or any doubts, you can write in the comments below, and I will enjoy answering you and giving you suggestions. As you have seen in the normal shawl or in the Trilly Sweater, where I made 3 different versions from the same pattern by knitting the same size, it is important also to play and be creative in order to make the garment we like the best. If we like a loose gauge, it is important to work with a loose gauge, because only when we wear something that we like and it makes us feel well and fine, we will communicate it to the world. So let's follow also our taste, and then we can make the changes to make the garment we like for our proportions. So, it's fun and creative, and we have to do what we like best and wear. So enjoy your creativity. And if you want to, you can also find me on Instagram as Fassio. See you in the next video. Bye!